Okay, I'm just going to start broadcast now so you can listen out for your cue.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the EuroSTAR October webinar series. The title of today's webinar is The Commoditization of Testing, and today's presenter is Iain McCowatt, and we are delighted to announce that Iain has been added to the program for the EuroSTAR Conference 2013 in Gothenburg. If you have any questions for Iain during the course of this webinar, you can type them into the questions field on your control panel, and I will ask these questions to Iain and during the Q&A session directly after the webinar. You can get a copy of these slides as well as view a recording of the webinar on the EuroSTAR Conference website after the webinar. And you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ESComms, and you can connect with the EuroSTAR Conference team at ESComms, as well as today's presenter at Iain McCowatt. So now I'm just going to hand you over to today's presenter, Iain. Hi, Iain.
Hello. Thank you, Dara. Okay, thank you, Dara. So, just in way of introduction, what am I talking about today? Well, I'm going to be talking about a trend that I've seen over the last few years within testing. This is drawn from personal experience, and to a degree it's biased by my own experiences, by the types of testing project that I've been working in. Except for a couple of years that I spent working for a startup, I've been working primarily in enterprise IT. And I think this trend is particularly acute there. I've also largely worked as a consultant providing software testing services. So as a testing vendor in the past, perhaps my view is a little bit shaded by that. What I'm not going to be doing is ranting against outsourcing and offshoring. I think the trend to outsource software testing services is definitely linked to the commoditization of testing, but it needn't necessarily be so. I have seen outsourced and offshore testing teams who have managed to do something other than provide a commodity testing service. Now, as I talk through this, I'm going to refer to three very different projects in order to illustrate what a commodity testing service looks like and to illustrate what it feels like to be part of something that isn't a commodity. Okay, so the first project, Project 1, started out as an opportunity. Two people, a customer, a vendor, friends, playing golf of all things, having a conversation. You know what? I need some testers. I need to move all of my testing out of my development team and get some other people to do it for me. Hey, you know what? I've got some people who are currently doing support, and perhaps we can make them into testers for you. So as a result of this, a software testing service was born. A number of people were transferred into a testing role, although they didn't necessarily have a testing background to begin with. And because of that, there was a lot of focus on a cookie-cutter approach, an approach to testing that was based on process and methodology. Unfortunately, because the process was there, but the experience wasn't necessarily there, things started to go a little bit wrong. Information provided by the testing team wasn't really helping the projects out that much. The client began to get a little bit concerned about this, started thinking, you know, maybe this isn't going on so well. So got more involved in the day-to-day management of the project. And as a result, we started to see almost a master-slave relationship form, whereby the clients were directing the work being performed by the testers. And with that lack of trust, there was an increase in the amount of processes, an increase on the focus of process, and on the focus of measurement, and so on and so forth, until there was actually very little room left for testing to take place. If we look at a typical team within this project, if you looked at the typical team within this project, you would see perhaps 1 out of 4 people acting as a test lead and not doing any hands-on testing, purely filling out documentation, purely reporting the numbers, and so on and so forth. Much of the conversation focused on process, with very little emphasis on the content of the testing. What is it that we need to test? How can we go about testing it? As opposed to blah, 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 the test environment, blah, 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 test design, test execution, test exit report, etc., etc. Testing began to disappear as process focus and measurement focus took over. Well, eventually, it was game over. Because testing wasn't providing the kinds of information that the projects need, because they were bound to follow process, there was a decline steadily over time in the relationship. Now, this particular testing project, it wasn't the first testing vendor, and I'm sure it won't be the last. It has changed hands several times since then. There will be many more, I should imagine, to come. This was a commodity testing service. Now, what do I mean when I say a commodity? Well, according to Investopedia, when something becomes indistinguishable from any other product or service, and the only reason that a consumer will select a particular product is price alone, then it's become a commodity. A great example is milk. If you go to the supermarket, you'll find a variety of different brands of milk. And unless you're buying something very specific, unless you're looking for something very particular, pretty much all milk costs the same. It really doesn't make an awful lot of difference to you. Price is the only factor that you take into consideration. If somebody starts selling milk a lot cheaper, you're likely to go for the cheapest brand. We see this in testing services where there is much competition based on price and very little other way of testing services to differentiate from one another. Now, where do we see this? It is very, very common in the enterprise, particularly amongst organizations that have got global buying power, where they are able to resource their testing from anywhere in the world. You know, some organizations are tied to particular geographies, particularly government organizations in the public sector. Those that can go anywhere in the world for their services and take advantage of cheaper labor markets, that's somewhere where you're very likely to see this kind of trend. It's endemic in the consulting industry. By and large, testing services or testing service vendors will operate a high volume, low margin model. There are some exceptions, but this is what you most commonly see. We'll do lots and lots of testing for you, and we're not going to make an awful lot of money off any particular piece of it, but because we've got so much, we think we've got a sustainable business. I've seen less evidence of this trend amongst software vendors. If anybody knows otherwise, I'd be very interested to hear from you about that. So why does this happen? Well, I think a lot of people see testing like this. How to run fast. Put one foot in front of the other as quickly as you possibly can. Now, I'm a runner. There's probably other runners on this webinar today. I wonder who here could win an Olympic gold by following this advice? Put one foot in front of the other as quickly as possible. The thing is with testing is, the stuff that's obvious looks easy. Yeah, read a spec, play around with the software a little bit, maybe write some tests, write up some bug reports, write up an exit report, Bob's your uncle, tested. Unfortunately, that's not where the action is in testing. Most of the action in testing happens upstairs, happens in the brain, happens in the mind. And that stuff's not obvious. So when we look at testing, it can look incredibly easy. We don't recognize necessarily the sophistication or difficulty of what's going on. Further, a lot of people, particularly project managers, see testing to be just like this. Tasks on a Gantt chart, things to be done before we can take the software live. They don't necessarily recognize that we provide information. The amount of information, the amount of experimentation that we might do in order to provide that information is highly variable. A lot of it's driven by the underlying quality of the software when we receive it. I had a conversation with Fiona Charles some months ago, and she pointed out something very important. You can estimate all you like, but as soon as you find a bug, all bets are off. And this is entirely true. Estimating testing is a phenomenally difficult thing because you never know what you're going to find. You don't know what you don't know. So thinking of testing like this, tasks on a Gantt chart, things to be done before taking the software live, doesn't recognize the reality of testing, which is often you will adjust and change as you proceed, as you learn, as you discover. So if we think about the industry as a whole, if we think about this trend as a whole, how does it happen? Well, as I've said, often testing is perceived as being low-skilled. And as a result of that, people tend to think, well, if it's low-skilled, anybody can do it. It must be a commodity. If testing's cheap, I'm going to have some of that. So, if it's cheap, if it's a commodity, I want to have it cheaply, as cheap as possible. And if there's a demand for cheap testing, then someone is going to fulfill that demand. You know, if there's a demand for tobacco, there's going to be people willing to sell tobacco. That leads to there being a supply of cheap testing. And of course, if you're buying testing services and you can see people selling cheap testing, it's a reasonable conclusion to think, well, if people are selling testing cheaply, it must be pretty low skilled. And if people are selling testing cheaply, it must be a commodity. Now, the more we see testing as being low skilled, the more we're likely to suppress the demand for skilled testing. If anybody can do this, why would I want to pay for a skilled tester? If I don't need particular skills in order to test, why do I want to pay for skilled testers? And as the demand for skilled testers diminishes, so too with the supply of skilled testers. If there's no market for it, if nobody wants you, then how are you going to find a way to make a living as a skilled tester? Those who do have the skills will disappear from the market. They'll go and find something else to do that will pay the mortgage. If there's no demand for skilled testers, where's the incentive for anyone to develop the skills required to test well? And if there's no skilled testers in the market, or very, very few skilled testers in the market, a tiny majority of people with testing skills, good testing skills, then of course it's going to be perceived as being a low-skilled profession. This has got some nasty, nasty effects. If there aren't skilled testers around, if there aren't that many skilled testers available for work, then we can damage collaboration. If we have people who don't know how to speak the language of their stakeholders, don't know how to talk to business users and understand what they need, to see below what's being said and understand underlying needs. If we have people without the skills to relate to developers and project managers, then how can we possibly hope that they'll collaborate effectively with their teams? And as collaboration is damaged, we'll see, so too we'll see more and more testing failures. Now, you can take this either way. If we see testing is bad, testing messed up my project, testing was no good for me, didn't give me any useful information, there's two ways we can take that. It might be a reasonable conclusion to say, well, you know what? Maybe it went horribly wrong for me because I didn't have any skilled testers. But alternatively, many people draw the conclusion, testing's crap, therefore it's obviously a low-skilled thing. And as the perception of testing as a low-skilled occupation becomes more dominant, we get some chilling effects on collaboration. Then testers, yeah, you don't need to talk to them. Don't worry about them. They're not going to give us anything useful anyway. And thus it goes. There's another dynamic that we tend to see, particularly when we look at the software testing vendors. This looks a little bit like the prisoner's dilemma. So, say we've got two vendors, vendor A and vendor B, competing with one another. This often is the standing starting position. Each vendor is scared that if they don't compete on price, they will lose market share to their competitor. The result of this, however, is a race to the bottom, each trying to undercut each other in order to get short-term revenues, building short-term relationships with their clients, providing something that's not truly effective. Everybody loses. The vendors lose because they're getting low margins, because they get a lot of churn in their business, because selling something that's not terribly effective doesn't tend to stick around very long. And the customers lose as well, because they're getting substandard testing. There is an alternative. If vendors in the marketplace look to build truly effective, skill-based testing services, to build long-term relationships based on trust, to differentiate themselves, potentially even specialize in niche areas where not many other people can do good testing, then they all stand to win. They stand to win in terms of more fruitful, longer-term relationships, enhanced margins, and the customers stand to win as well. Stand to win as well in terms of getting better testing. So, what is the result of this commoditization trend? Well, I think I've already indicated master-slave relationships and the chilling effect that this can have on collaboration. I've seen this firsthand where a client's team doesn't trust what they see from the testers. They get more and more intrusive in terms of trying to control what the testers are doing and how, enforcing more and more process, enforcing more and more controls, enforcing more and more measurement. And as these walls are built up, testing has far less flexibility in order to change course when it needs to, in order to exploit what it's learned to learn more, in terms of being able to speak to the people that the testers need to speak to in order to learn things about the software. I have worked in environments where testers were not allowed to speak to developers because of this kind of relationship, this kind of master-slave relationship. One of the major results that you get from this is information starvation. Testers get cut off from the projects. Now, we are information brokers. We generate information, we share information. In order to do so, by and large, we need information. And there's only so far that you can go with formal, explicit knowledge transfer type activities. A lot of the information that we use in order to recognize important problems is of the tacit variety. It's stuff that we don't necessarily know that we know. Learning that, acquiring that tacit knowledge, is largely a social activity. It's largely about being part of the heart and the soul, part of the life of a project. If testers aren't allowed to interact with people, if they're not allowed to ask questions, if they're not allowed to have a casual chat with somebody, be it a project manager, a BA, a user, or a developer, it can be phenomenally difficult for them to build this kind of information, to build this kind of tacit knowledge. Now, from the vendor's perspective, there are some particularly unpleasant consequences as well. If you're selling a commodity testing service, by and large it's about volume. It's about volume and volume at low margin. Now, the less that you're actually making from a particular testing gig, the harder it is to justify having skilled people there. A rallying call on many of these kind of gigs is juniorize, juniorize, juniorize. Put in people who are less experienced, more junior, and therefore cheaper in order to maximize the kind of return that we're going to get. Of course, the more junior people that you throw into any particular project, the more the management tends to have to rely on controls, processes, methodology, and so on and so forth. And also, when we do this, when we juniorize, we are suppressing the demand for skills. Ultimately, the end result of this is the testing, the quality of the testing suffers. The projects themselves suffer by not gaining the information that they need to make decent decisions. Okay, that's depressing enough. Let's look at a different project now. This stands in stark contrast. This started up at the beginning of 2012. And rather than attempting to provide a cookie-cutter service, it started on the basis of talking to the client and trying to understand what their problem was. What were they trying to solve? What were the challenges that the project had experienced? And this was a project, a particular software delivery that was in its second release. So we started on this basis. What are you trying to get out of the project? What are you trying to get out of testing? What kinds of information do you need? What kinds of challenges have you experienced? Now, the previous release had been somewhat challenged. The particular solution that was being implemented by and large was an ETL solution. This was tested largely on the basis of manual samples, and yet there were many thousands of different possible permutations of the transformation rules that formed part of this ETL. We concluded that we could very effectively test that with the use of a variety of tools that we would build for it in order to do high volume checking of the ETL. We ended up building a tool that was testing somewhere or checking somewhere in the region of 10 million fields every minute. It's something that our client had not seen done before. And actually turned around and said, you know what, we had somebody look at this, and we were told that it wouldn't be possible. Actually, what the other vendor had meant was, it's not possible with our tools. Along the way, we ran into a little bit of budgetary constraint. We were estimating the testing was going to maybe run into the region of about 1.5 million Canadian dollars. We attended a meeting, a project planning meeting, when we were told, you know what, we've only got a budget of $500,000 for this, and your competitors telling us that they can do it cheaper than you can. In fact, they're telling us that they can do it for the $500,000 budget that we've got. Coincidentally, this particular competitor, this particular testing vendor, was also providing the project management services to the same project and had formed the budget. So we turned around and we asked the client, you know what, go back to your other vendor, go back to this competitor and ask them what are they going to give you for the $500,000. We've already had a lot of good conversations. I think we understand your problems. And you understand what we're proposing that we can do for you for $1.5 million. Why don't you ask the other vendor, ask our competitor, what are they going to give you for $500,000? So off they trotted, questions were asked, and the answer came back from our competitor. 2,000 test cases. 2,000 test cases? Okay. What? Testing what? 2,000 test cases that do what exactly? And the answer came back from the competitor, oh, we haven't figured that out yet. Utter nonsense. This was someone throwing some numbers into a spreadsheet and coming out with, oh, for $500,000 we'll give you 2,000 test cases. This was pure nonsense methodology. It had nothing to do with the content of the project, the content of the software, the content of the testing required in this particular instance to help solve the customer's problems. Ultimately, we got the business. We decided to give it a go. Sometime later, our client turned around and said, you know, this was a leap of faith. You suggested something to us that we weren't sure was possible, that we'd never seen happen before. It was really unconventional, but we're really happy. This project was the beginning of an ongoing relationship. It's now well into its second year. This particular team, although I've left them, I've moved on now, tested on a further release. And that particular business now represents a growing portfolio of work. So, compare and contrast Project 1 and Project 2. Project 2 is not a commodity testing service. What was different about it? Well, it attended to the problem that the customer was trying to solve. Instead of starting from process and methodology, it started from an understanding of the problem and the design of a solution. Yes, process was implemented. Yes, methodologies and tools were invented for the purposes of this project. But they came second. What came first was an understanding of the problem that we were attempting to solve. So, if you're a tester, whether you're a part of a testing service or whether you're testing software produced by your own employer, there are ways of differentiating. How can we differentiate testing services? First and foremost, people. Passion speaks volumes. Skill and the creativity to create new methods, create new tools, create new ways of solving a problem are critical to differentiating. We also can base differentiation on relationships and trust. Where there are no relationships, where there is no trust, at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to sell a testing service. In Project 2, the relationship was there, largely because we'd expressed an interest and taken the time to learn what the client really needed. In Project 1, those relationships weren't there because it was simply a case of, yeah, testing, ram the testing in there, try and make it work. Here's your standard methodology, away you go, guys. You can also base differentiation on new ideas, new technologies, new ways of working, although often those don't last. Tools can be copied, approaches can be copied. So that can be quite a fleeting source of differentiation. Location can help as well. A lot of commodity services tend to follow the labor arbitrage model and be provided from areas of the world where pay levels are lower, things are cheaper, services are cheaper to provide. That's not always the best way. It can work in some circumstances. However, often when decisions are made around the water cooler, it's really, really useful to have somebody by the water cooler listening in and participating in making those decisions. Sometimes, if you've got a testing service running maybe one time zone away, you can exploit cultural similarities in the same time of day and so on and so forth to offer something quite different from services that are being offered from other sides of the world. A lot of this comes down to figuring out where's the best place to put the work. Which bits of the work will work remotely? Which bits of the work need to take place locally? Breaking it down into pieces in order to think, this isn't just one homogeneous mass. There are different types of work within the testing that can be conducted in different locations. What's not a source of differentiation? Process, methodology, templates, tools and technology that everybody else is using, standards, anything that's easily replicated. I have to laugh. I've been to so many meetings through the years where people have been pushing the need to create a company-wide methodology that we can sell to testing clients. We need to differentiate ourselves based on our detailed testing methodology in the books that we'll publish as a result of it. I've not once met a single client who went through methodology, comparing methodology when selecting a software testing vendor. It just doesn't happen. It's largely based on relationship and commercials. You don't sit down when you're buying a testing service, take two methodologies from two competing vendors and do a pairwise comparison and say, hey, these guys have got a really good methodology. Look, all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. Well, there's a few spelling mistakes in this, that one. Let's push that to one side and go with the first guys. It doesn't happen. It's not a source of differentiation. These things are very easy to copy. And the best that you can ever hope for is a very, very fleeting differentiation, something that does not last. People will catch up. People will copy. Finally, Project 3. The irony is, Project 3 was the same client as Project 1. A few different players. Critically, we approach things much differently. This started out in a meeting several years ago with a number of different vendors sitting in the same room as the client. The client was sharing various things about how they hoped to approach testing in the coming year. One of the vendors, ourselves, got involved, spoke up, sometimes disagreed, sometimes put forward contrarian views, but made it clear that they cared, about testing. The other vendors in the room all sat silent. Maybe a year later, I was talking to the guy that ultimately would become the client of this testing service. And he said to me, Ian, I'm kind of getting fed up of these so-called managed services where I'm doing all the managing, and every time I come up with any ideas about how we might do things slightly differently, my vendor turns around and says, yes sir, I'll do that. Where the testers were not engaged in any way, shape or form with the problem, potential solutions to the project's problems. So we had some initial conversations, and we talked about ways in which the quality of testing might vary, attributes of the quality of testing, and which of those attributes were most important on this particular project. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So we decided to do business. We started working together. And then one of the testers on the gig turned around and asked the developers, it'd be really useful to have a look at the code. Where is it? Can I have a look at it, please? And they were shocked. They could not, they were blown away and ecstatic that a tester actually had expressed this much interest that they were asking where the code was. A key theme that we stressed was that tests are experiments. A test is not just a simple check that you hope passes and are interested in if it fails. But tests are experiments that return some form of information to you. And we built some really interesting experiments as part of this project, whereas the previous vendor had maybe 200 tests that they ran through every single time. And by the way, although this was an OLTP solution, most of those tests were messing around at the GUI level where very little of the action was happening, where very little of the logic was actually embedded. We did other experiments. We built a test harness to tap production data and throw millions of records, track millions of transactions through this solution every day, and analyze that data so that we understand the coverage of the internal logic that was covering. And doing so, we provided all manner of information that they weren't getting from the previous testing. Although I've moved on now, the future for this particular project, for this particular relationship, looks bright. We took a very different approach. We did something quite unorthodox. We built upon a solid relationship that we already built. And pricing, well, obviously, you have the pricing conversation. It was part of the conversation. But we weren't defined by that. We were defined by what we could do to help the project. So again, this was not a commodity testing service. So, we talk a lot about software quality. We very, very rarely talk about the quality of testing. Maybe we should have to think about the quality of testing. What defines the quality of testing provided on any particular project? Well, I think there are a variety of characteristics. If we think first about external characteristics, we think about what is it that we are doing? What is it that we are providing to our clients? Information. Testing is all about providing information. Is that information relevant? Is that information accurate? Is that information up to date? There's also some other characteristics that might be relevant to you over the long term with an ongoing relationship. Are we providing appropriate transparency? Because that builds trust. Are we adaptable? Can we change in order to take account of the evolving needs of the project? Any particular piece of software goes through a life cycle. The information that's relevant when something's in prototype is very, very different from when it's been in production for a few years. It's different again to when you're about to replace it, remove it, mothball it. And finally, the sustainability. How are we building our practices? How are we building our tools and supporting our tools? How are we building knowledge in such a way that it's sustainable within the team over the long haul? So, what can you do? It very much depends on whether you're a customer of testing, whether you're a vendor, somebody who's selling testing, or whether you're a tester in your own right. Certainly, I think customers of testing would be well served by watching their vendors closely, by watching their testers closely. Are they actually interested in the problems that you have? Do they understand that problem? Do they care about that problem? Have they got any new, interesting, different ideas about how to solve it? And do they actually have the skills to deliver on those ideas? Vendors. Those selling testing services should dare to be different. Because if you're not different, you're a commodity. You're the same as everybody else. Secondly, sack the salesman and actually consult. One of the best ways to sell a testing service is to talk to people, to understand their problems. Unfortunately, salesmen really tend to like pre-packaged things that they can easily wrap their heads around. That largely means process and methodology, which is not a differentiator. It's important also to be willing to say no. If you are differentiating and you don't want to sell based on price, but a particular client wants testing cheap and isn't interested in anything else, this is not the basis of a sustainable relationship. It's best to walk away. It's that kind of shared value, that kind of relationship that makes any business worth doing. And also, this is about education. Educating yourselves as to what the problems are, educating yourselves as to potential solutions, educating clients as to rational limitations and constraints on testing, and so on and so forth. Everybody is continuously learning. And individual testers, nobody can empower you. In fact, people have turned around and said to me, Ian, I'm going to empower you to do blah, 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 blah. Well, nonsense. Nobody can empower me to do anything except for myself. Empowerment starts with the individual. So don't wait to be given an agenda by your management to say, we want you to learn X, Y, and Z. This is how we're going to deliver that learning to you. We're going to send you on these courses, blah, blah, blah. Drive it yourself. At the end of the day, you own your career, nobody else. To help you along the way, learn how to learn. Testers are professional learners. We learn about our clients' problems. We learn about the software. We learn how to communicate with people. We learn how to use different tools and technologies to test more effectively. We are professional learners. It's important to learn how to learn in order to do so. Be willing to learn absolutely anything and everything that might help you test better. Never be afraid to learn SQL or to learn a programming language or what have you. And don't be afraid to invent. Don't be afraid to make things up as you go along. Don't be afraid to invent a new tool or a new approach to doing something. Don't be afraid to borrow from other people. Don't be afraid to borrow good ideas, whatever their source, and maybe tweak them and remix them. By doing this kind of thing, you can differentiate yourself. You can make yourself different to the other testers out there. So, a final word. Commodity testing isn't going to go anywhere fast. I'm sure we will see this for decades, if not generations to come. There's always going to be a demand based on the dream of getting testing done cheap. However, there are some vendors out there, I'm not a vendor anymore, but there are some vendors out there who are successfully exploiting this in order to make themselves different from everybody else and to build differentiated services, doing things that their competitors can't, building niches where they're doing things that nobody else can. I'm optimistic. I think this demonstrates that there is demand in the industry as a whole for something different and something better. And that convinces me that there are good testing roles out there, fulfilling testing roles out there for those who are willing to learn and those who have the skills to fill them. And lastly, I'm presenting in Gothenburg in a few weeks' time. I'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for that webinar. I'm just going to open up my screen here again now. So we're going to open the floor to your questions. So if you have any questions for Ian and you haven't already typed them, you can do so now. And while you're typing your questions, let me just bring your attention to our EuroSTAR webinar archive, where you can get access to over 80 on-demand software testing webinars. And by joining the EuroSTAR community, not only will you get access to these webinars, but you'll also get access to over 600 software testing presentations, podcasts, ebooks, videos, and more. This year's conference is in Gothenburg, Sweden. It will take place in the Swedish Exhibition and Congress Center from the 4th to the 7th of November. And there is already over 850 attendees already confirmed, including today's presenter, Iain McCowatt. So now we're just going to open up the questions here, Ian, and we'll just go through them. So the first question I have for you here is, how can clients and skilled testers recognize and protect themselves against a commoditized approach?
Okay, so if you're buying testing, the best way to protect yourself from commodity testing is to be able to recognize it. If you've got a vendor who walks into your office and says, yeah, I've got this great big test factory and here's my processes and here's my methodology, and by the time they've walked out you realize they haven't once asked you about what it is you do and what it is you're trying to achieve and what it is that you're experiencing in terms of specific problems and the kinds of information that your project needs, there's a very good chance that they're a commodity vendor. And really all they're interested in is selling their approach as opposed to helping you to solve your problems. For an individual tester, it's more about where are you willing to work? Where are you willing to work? Are you willing to sit in a testing sweatshop and follow process and not actually learn that much about the software and not actually learn about the software, learn about testing? Sometimes it's a trade-off. Sometimes you can actually learn in that kind of environment, although it can be slow and it can be hard. At the end of the day, though, you have the power and the right to vote with your feet and find somewhere where you're going to find, to move somewhere where you're going to find fulfilling work and the opportunity to learn. Be brave, have courage.
The next question I have for you, Ian, is what would you do if you were in the middle of a process and measurement heavy organization to break free, to start the right direction?
Be loud and be obnoxious and have no fear. And frankly, if I can't change it, it's probably not somewhere I want to be anyway. That's the easy answer. There's a hard and long way of looking at it. And that is, generally, this indicates some kind of need. Testing is very much misunderstood because we see what's on the surface. We see the obvious and visible things. We see the putting one foot in front of each other very, very quickly. So when people are asking for process and they're asking for methodology and they're asking for measurement, they don't necessarily know what they're asking for. Maybe their underlying need is to get more informative testing, and they think the way that they're going to get that is through process and methodology. Perhaps they need, perhaps there's a level of discomfort there and they want to understand how testing is helping them, how testing is performing in any particular area. But the only way that they have of articulating that to you is to ask for measurements. This is prevalent in banking, where it's a numbers-oriented organization. If you want information, you tend to ask for numbers. By taking the time to speak to people and to understand what the needs actually are, as opposed to what's being asked for, you can start to find ways of fulfilling those needs without fulfilling the ask, without implementing heavy process, heavy measurement. It's a lot of hard work, but it can be worth it. Yeah.
Okay. The next question I have here is, based on your past experiences, whether outsourcing vendors are willing to change from inside instead of commoditizing.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Sure. It says here, based on your past experiences, whether outsourcing vendors are willing to change from inside instead of commoditizing.
So if vendors are prepared to change to differentiate themselves as opposed to simply offering a commodity service, is that it?
Yes, that appears to be the question coming through here.
Okay. Okay. So it can be a gamble because of this fear that if I don't compete on price and everybody else is, I'm just going to lose market share to everybody else. It will vary from vendor to vendor. I had a certain amount of success in Atlantic Canada doing this, making this change from commodity to differentiated testing service. That was a fairly easy sell for me because Atlantic Canada can't compete with certain other parts of the world on price alone. You simply can't. The cost structure is all wrong. So if you can't offer a service that's going to compete on price, you're pretty much forced to offer a service that's going to differentiate itself in some other way. So selling this to my own internal customers, my own executives, etc., was fairly easy. I can imagine that that would be more challenging for other people in other parts of the world where it's all about volume and low margin.
The next
Largely, it's going to come down to the circumstances that you find yourself in, what the structure of the particular organization is, what the structure of their own particular market is, who their direct competitors are, and so on and so forth. But I don't see any reason why a testing vendor could not start growing another line of business in parallel to their commodity shop that attempts to do something different, has higher rates and therefore higher margins, emphasizes skill, emphasizes solving difficult problems, perhaps develops into particular market niches that nobody else is serving. That would seem like a sensible strategy to me if I were running a big testing vendor that had existing commodity revenues. I think I'd try and make that change progressively, prove to my internal stakeholders that differentiating can actually work from a business perspective. Okay.
The next question I have here is, commodity testing does have a place, but it needs to be compensated by skilled testers working with consumer performing a proper consultancy. Key is a defining role and tasks. Would you agree?
Sorry, Dara, could you run that past me again, please?
Sure, it's quite a long question here, so I can repeat it for you. It says here, it's more of a statement really to see if you agree. It says, commodity testing does have a place, but it needs to be compensated by skilled testers working with consumer performing a proper consultancy. Key is defining the roles and tasks. Would you agree?
No. If we just focus on the last part of that statement, focusing on roles and tasks, well, I prefer focusing on skill. I prefer focusing on the individual testers. I prefer focusing on helping them kit themselves out with the skills that they need to solve testing problems. That means how to go about talking to people. That means how to analyze a problem, how to think about testing, how to understand the natural constraints that there are on testing and articulate that in a language that stakeholders are going to understand. I think if I found myself defining roles and defining tasks, then I'm probably just going down the process route. I can't predict all of the problems that testers are going to face on a daily basis. So I can't define a process that's going to solve all of their problems for them. I can't define the roles and the tasks that are appropriate to solve all of those problems because I haven't encountered them yet. But if I equip people with the skills that they need, they can solve those problems on their own. I'd start with skills.
And next question I have here is, how can testing add business value?
Well, a lot of testing, unfortunately, doesn't add an awful lot of value because it's just saying, yeah, blah, 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 pass, blah, 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 fail, as opposed to providing any kinds of information that are relevant to the projects that they're serving. If you're not providing information that the projects find useful, then you're not providing any value whatsoever. So that's the first place to go. Understand what kinds of information are going to be relevant to the project and figure out how you're going to go about acquiring and providing and effectively communicating that information.
I think we've time for just one last question here, and this question is, what is business assurance through QA?
I'm sorry, Dara, I struggle to hear that.
No problem, I'll repeat myself. The question is, what is business assurance through QA?
Okay, business assurance through QA. I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question. What is business assurance through QA? These are a couple of buzzwords. Let's take a guess. Business assurance, assuring the business through quality assurance. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really understand what the question's all about, to be quite honest. Testing helps provide businesses with information that helps them make good decisions. How that relates to the question, I'm not entirely sure. Sorry.
Okay, I think we've gone over the hour mark now, so we're going to wrap things up. And I just wanted to thank today's presenter, Iain McCowatt, for his presentation. I would also like to thank all the attendees for attending the webinar and all your questions. The webinar is now over. We'll say goodbye and thank you.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you in Gothenburg.